Okay, I'm going to launch things then this evening. Thank you very much for joining us. Good evening. Welcome to this event with the Foreign Policy Centre and the Aston Centre for Europe, where I am co-director. My name is Carolyn Rowe and I'm going to be managing the discussion this evening. So you're very welcome to this discussion on making their voices heard, relations between the UK's nations and regions and the EU post-Brexit. Now, we see this as a very welcome opportunity to reflect on how best to enhance and strengthen links between the UK as a whole and the European Union as we complete that transition now to becoming a third country outside of the EU decision-making nexus. And now that Britain no longer has a seat around the decision-making table in Brussels, arguably there's more need than ever to have a multiplicity of British voices making their voices heard within that system and looking for ways to exploit the opportunities presented by the European Union and be engaged, delivering real results for people, for businesses, for growth back here in the UK. All of that's hugely important. So this broader question of developing a much more sort of multi-level approach to the UK's international relations with the European Union is regarded in some sense as something of a kind of parallel diplomacy or a paradiplomacy within the European context. And in that sense, this is all very much about allowing sub-state interests, so national, regional interests across the UK from all of Britain's jurisdictions to flesh out in a kind of practical sense the broad direction of foreign policy as it's set. So it offers up the detail and the nuance that's often missing from the overarching interactions and agreements. So international relations, we all understand, is very much in the strictest sense the domain of the central state authorities, and that's very clear from the devolution settlement, for instance, where international engagement was never part of the devolved competencies. It's always a reserved issue. But obviously the European Union's policy portfolio overlapped considerably with a lot of the devolved competences, areas such as fisheries and agriculture, various aspects of the environment, climate change portfolio. So there were very clear reasons as to why the devolved authorities in particular had this legitimate need to be fully engaged in the European process. But even at the regional level in non-devolved England, there are significant overlaps between policy responsibilities. And the environmental, the social, the economic challenges that any kind of regional, local government face are often global in scope and require collaborative solutions, which will involve governments and thinking from outside our national context, so around the world. And the success of policy making per se, therefore, depends on that ability to create and maintain positive relations with individuals and governments and associations, academic institutions overseas as well. So Brexit, needless to say, has completely reconfigured the opportunities for engaging meaningfully with the EU and with Britain's European partners. So what next? How can we continue to maintain strong and effective partnerships between Britain's nations and regions on the one hand and the European policy community on the other? What specifically is the purpose of such engagement, and what kind of benefits can these direct interactions between the nations and the regions of the UK and the European system actually deliver? So taking forward some of these questions this evening, I'm delighted to welcome an extremely experienced and distinguished panel of speakers who bring to this discussion perspectives from across a number of the UK's jurisdictions, with a focus on the devolved nations of Scotland and Wales, as well as specific insights from the English regions. So our first speaker this evening will be Stephen Gethin, who's a former MP representing North East 5, has served as the SNP spokesperson on Europe and international affairs, and at one time was also Europe advisor to the First Minister. So he's now based in the School of International Relations at the University of St Andrews and is author of a book called Nation to Nation, Scotland's Foreign Policy Footprint. So good evening, Stephen. Second speaker joining us will be Professor Richard Wynne-Jones, who's Director of Cardiff University's Wales Governance Centre and is an expert on contemporary Welsh politics and devolved politics in the UK. And he's written widely on territorial differentiation, on Brexit and the future of the UK, and is a regular media commentator on these and related issues. So welcome, Richard. Our third speaker, kindly joining us this evening, is Teresa Griffin, who was a member of European Parliament representing the northwest of England from 2014 to 2020. So the northwest in itself is a region with over 7.5 million inhabitants. So Itself, it is more populous than half of the EU's member states. And in the European Parliament, Theresa was a member of the Industry, Research and Energy Committee, as well as a substitute member on the Transport and Tourism Committee. And prior to becoming a member of the European Parliament, Theresa was active in local politics, serving on Liverpool City Council, where as lead member for economic development and Europe, she was instrumental in securing Objective 1 status for the city and for channeling billions of pounds worth of investment to the Liverpool City region. So welcome to you, Theresa, and thank you for joining us this evening. Claire Moody, joining us next, was also a one-time member of the European Parliament, also elected in 2014 to represent the southwest of England, also over 5 million people, inhabitants in that region. During her time in the European Parliament, she was vice chair of the European Parliament's Subcommittee on Security and Defence and a member of the Foreign Affairs, Women's Rights and Industry, Research and Energy Committees. So she also has extensive experience as a trade union official and presently acts as one of the chief executives of Equally Ours, which is an NGO which aims to advance equality and human rights issues. So thank you also very much for joining us this evening, Claire. And our final speaker on the panel this evening is Dr. Kirsty Hughes, who's not only an expert commentator on Scottish relations with the EU, but is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and a former director of the Scottish Centre on European Relations. So thank you for joining us as well this evening, Kirsty. So the plan is this evening for us to hear some introductory remarks from all of our panelists, and then after that we'll move forward to a Q&A discussion. So please do feel free to add your comments to the question and answer function here on Zoom, perhaps rather than in the chat, and we'll put these directly to the panelists shortly. So thank you very much for that. Without further ado, I'm going to pass the floor to our first speaker this evening, Stephen Gethin. So Stephen, over to you.
Thank you, and thanks very much for that introduction and for having me along today. I wanted just to start off my remarks, and it's so good having Kirsty here who'll be able to correct anything where she thinks I've got it wrong later on. But I want to just provide a little bit of context, first of all, about how Scotland sees its relationship with the European Union, that I sometimes think is quite helpful for a UK-wide audience. Scotland is and remains overwhelmingly pro-European, pro-EU. Its two governing parties, the SNP and the Green Party, remain committed to Scotland, if not the UK, joining or rejoining the European Union as a member state in its own right. And that is, it has to be said, a popular opinion to have, remains a popular opinion to have, with support for the European Union remaining high in Scotland. Scotland, well, the UK is a multinational state. That's something else that's really important to remember, that it's a multinational state, and Scotland is one of the constituent parts of that state, has always had a very specific relationship with the European Union. The SNP, and I'll talk about this in a moment, has obviously had seen the European Union as being an important element of its external policy, because the SNP sees itself as one of its aims, its primary aim, if you like, is independence as a member state and a full member state of the EU. However, this wasn't just the SNP. So Labour and the Labour Liberal Democrat coalition saw engagement with the EU as being very, very important. Jack McConnell and Henry McLeish, both in particular, as Labour First Ministers, saw engagement with the EU as something that was very important for Scotland. But even if you go further back, pre-devolution, you had the Conservatives who opened Scotland House, Scotland Europa in Brussels, and I interviewed Philip Rycroft, the former Permanent Secretary at DECSU, who was even seconded into the European Commission as a member of Liam Britton's cabinet, but to look after Scottish interests. So this isn't something that's new, and I also think that bit of context is really important. The Scottish Government's attitude towards the European Union that sees as a key plank of its domestic policy agenda, it will continue to align where it can Scottish policies along with European policies, and that will become increasingly important with the cost of living crisis, as you see energy price rises, food and drink price rises, even security issues, and continuing to make that case for rejoining the European Union. Scotland House in Brussels will continue to be an incredibly important arm of the Scottish Government. It always has been and will continue to be, but I think the Scottish Government will have to invest further. The UK is now a a third country. Scotland is part of a third country, and that makes engagements with the European Union institutions all the harder than they were previously. In my opinion, the Scottish Government Office, although it's very good, fantastic officials, is probably a little bit understaffed for the task ahead, and that's something that Scottish ministers will have to think about. There will have to be investment at a political level, and I know Mike Russell, who was the former Cabinet Secretary for External Affairs in the Scottish Government, was planning on being out there, him or a minister being out there every month. Angus Robertson, who is half German and is a big fan of the European project, will continue that engagement. He's very enthusiastically in favour of the European project and Scotland's future membership, as is Neil Gray. So I think you'll see that political investment going forward. Also, when people talk about Scotland House and it being quite well resourced, it's actually not quite as well resourced as, say, other significant substate actors. Now, there are 300 substate actors or thereabouts in Brussels, some of them smaller than others. But Scotland would see itself, I think quite rightly, as being in the Premier League in areas like Bavaria, Flanders, and elsewhere, yet it probably doesn't invest as much as others do. On a UK level, I think within the UK, I think Scotland will continue to find common cause with Welsh Assembly government, with the Welsh government, with the Northern Irish government, even with parts of England, you know, such as Andy Burnham or Sadiq Khan. The main area of divergence, and there are many, many areas of divergence between the Scottish and UK government, is the European Union. And it's something that the UK government's policy towards the EU, rather competitive policy towards the EU, might be popular at a UK level, but it's very, very unpopular at Scottish level, amongst those who are pro-union and those who are pro-independence as well. So, what are the lessons for the UK? Well, within the UK, then I'm just going to finish on this, on whether or not the UK survives. Going forward, if the UK is to survive, then giving Scotland a bit more say in its relationship with the international community might be quite important. You've got to remember that successive polls have showed something like 2/3 of under 55s no longer believe in the state for which they carry a passport, that independence is incredibly popular across, you know, for people below the age of 60. As soon as you hit 60, it kind of falls off a cliff. There is a very significant challenge for people who are pro-union. So do you follow the German model, the Belgian model, the Danish model, whereby you give your sub-state actors much more diplomatic clout and recognition and allow them and work with them to expand that foreign policy and European footprint? If the UK isn't to survive, then that will have been driven by Brexit. And Scottish voters, if they back independence, would be looking for Scotland to rejoin the European Union as quickly as possible. In that case, the Scottish Government would have to look at investing in its institution building, in looking at areas where it has and hasn't met the acquis communautaire, and frankly, in engagement with the 27 other member states. So that would be a significant challenge. So I'm mindful that I've just got a limited amount of time. So I'll leave it with this, Carolyn. Very significant challenges, whether Scotland remains part of the UK or whether it doesn't, and Europe will be at the heart of that.
Great, thanks. Lots to think about there. Appreciate your comments. Thank you very much, Stephen. I'm going to pass straight over to Professor Richard Wynne-Jones. The floor's yours.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the introduction, Carolyn. And Stephen has been admirably brief, so he set a high bar for the rest of us. I'm going to start with just a couple of more general points about what I know about and what I don't know about here. So my expertise, such as it is writing about paradiplomacy beyond the EU. So, you know, there's some kind of interesting stuff about Wales and indeed Scotland in Africa in the context of aid. I've also written about intergovernmental relations within the EU, within the UK. What I've written less about is Welsh relationships with the EU. That's covered by my colleague Rachel Minto, but she's got a small baby at the moment and has got better things to do this afternoon than even beyond this call. I'm also going to talk, I'm also going to avoid talking about England, and that's because I've written quite a lot about England in this book, And one of the things about English regional government, as we describe in that book, is that there's so much instability. There's a lack of consensus, even on basic issues such as powers, even on the boundaries. And so it's a very, very different beast from Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish devolution. I'm also going to ignore Northern Ireland because the fact that you've got an international agreement, that is the Good Friday Agreement, means that there's a different nexus for international relations with Northern Ireland than exists for Wales and Scotland. So I'm going to focus on Wales and Scotland. And I'm afraid my overall message is a pretty bleak one, in as much as I think that the prospects for Wales and Scotland in terms of maintaining relationships at the European level are pretty bleak. We Wales and Scotland don't really have a constitutional locus that makes maintaining those relationships very straightforward. And neither, conversely, does the EU have an easy route to maintaining its relations with the regions of the UK. I mean, one of the kind of fundamental myths that has developed in the UK and actually was important in securing the overall results of the Brexit referendum is that the EU is a superstate and has eroded the boundaries of sovereign states. But actually the fundamental building block of the EU is the sovereign states. It is very careful to maintain if what we might term the diplomatic niceties in terms of dealing with other sovereign states. So there was, I think, a belief amongst some people in Wales who regretted the breaking of the European links that somehow the European Union would maintain them anyway, somehow. And that was never going to happen and hasn't happened. And of course, the version of Brexit that we have ended up with is one that fetishizes a particular version of state sovereignty in relation to the European Union. And we all see this, the whole kind of Frost play of refusing to refer to the European Union as an actor and all of those things. So we see that playing at the European level, but also that same attitude to Europe also plays internally with regard to the relationships to Wales and Scotland. So increasingly we have a state that regards devolution as an existential threat to the state, to the state's integrity and to that traditional notion of state sovereignty. And given that, I think it's highly unrealistic to expect the current UK government to be going out of its way to be facilitating or encouraging the maintenance of strong links between the sub-state level within the UK and the hated European Union. That's just not where the state is at. It's also worth recalling, so that's in the case of the kind of, in the context of the post-2016 version of Brexit that we've ended up with. It's also worth recalling that notwithstanding the very recent joint review of intergovernmental relations within the UK, published in January, which is full of all kinds of promising and nice things to have, the record of intergovernmental relations within the UK since 1999 under both Labour and Conservative administrations in London has been pretty dysfunctional. And I have to say that I don't think this review, however promising it may sound, is going to fundamentally challenge that, because my interpretation of the failure of IGR within the UK is that it's arisen from fundamentally different conceptions of the nature of a state. So if you listen to Mark Drakeford, the First Minister in Wales, who is of course Labour, a unionist, He says that the UK is fundamentally broken. He says that the UK needs to recognise the sovereignty of the constituent units of the UK, Wales, Scotland, England, and Northern Ireland, and so on and so forth. That's, like, I'm stressing this again, this is from the Labour First Minister in Wales, right? Stephen has already given the SNP position. So, I mean, even in Wales, the understanding of the state is fundamentally different from that which you get from the UK state, even actually from Keir Starmer. So I mean, I just don't think that that bridge is going to be built in any straightforward way. And of course, Brexit has exacerbated all of these differences in terms of understandings of the state. So for my part, I think that the best hope that we have as somebody who would like to maintain relations with our nearest neighbours, I was brought up in Anglesey. So the nearest big city to me when I was growing up was, well, I mean, is it Dublin or Liverpool? I mean, we'd go a lot to Dublin, okay? And the Anglesey economy, such as it is, one of the poorest parts of the UK, was heavily reliant on trade with Ireland. So I'm very much in favour of maintaining these strong links. But, you know, until the UK government changes its mind and decides we do need warm relations, functional relations with our nearest neighbours, I think all we can do is keep in the game. What does that mean? Maintaining links in Brussels. I take all of Stephen's points about how that is now more difficult because we don't fit in to the European structures. There's quite a lot of work going on. My colleague Charles Whitmore, who I noticed is watching us, is doing a lot of work trying to keep civil society organisations in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland engaged. So there are those kinds of things which can usefully happen, but I also think we need to be realistic. We can't wish Brexit away. We have to recognise the nature of the European Union. It is a state-based club at the end of the day. While we can try and keep in the game until there is a fundamental change of attitudes at the UK level, which I hope will come, I think these links are likely to become more attenuated, weaker, and you know, there's very little, unfortunately, we can do about that. Sorry to finish on a downbeat note.
Oh, it's interesting. No, thank you. A great contribution. The point you made about intergovernmental relations and the quality of intergovernmental relations, perhaps that's something we can touch on in the discussions later as well. But thank you very much indeed. Some great insights there. Thank you. Moving swiftly forward, I'm going to invite Teresa now to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. And the sun is shining in Liverpool. Every day in the European Parliament, a politician or staff member from every country and every party except the far right said, please stay, we want you to remain. And they are still saying, come back, we are looking after your star. But I don't think it's going to happen, as Richard has said, anytime soon. Heads of delegations in tears in the plenary in Strasbourg, the leading Danish newspaper carrying a front page article featuring the Social Democrat MEP Niels Fuslang saying, I'm going to miss UK MEPs a lot in the European Parliament. They are a strong voice for the climate and an important ally to us Danes. And we lose that when the British leave the EU. And because the European Parliament was consensual, we worked across party politics, so different to the UK, except, again, the far right. And that can be said for each of my 10 colleagues and the 20 we were before the 2019 European election, all leading lawmakers in their fields, from trade with Jude, to human rights, Claude, to Claire in science and space, and active campaigning regional politicians, a strong part of the Labour family, a leading delegation in the Social and Democrats group, and the wider family of the Party of European Socialists, and good Europeans from the Conservatives, like Charles Tannock, and Alan Smith from the SNP. And what we have been trying to do, Claire and I and my colleagues, is maintain some of those links, especially, for instance, with the SPD in Germany. Firstly, we need to try to maintain our influence politically in the European Parliament by these more means which are not based in legislation, through regular meetings. And I handed my legislative work, for instance, in renewables, energy poverty, and just transition to newly elected SND and Green MEPs from other member states. So the work goes on, and informally, we meet on a regular basis. It's not easy, as we have lost our regular presence, but we have to try. And we have to stay involved with EP staff, and we have to stay involved with colleagues from the Council and the Commission, especially, as Carolyn said in her introduction, in climate change and the energy crisis. Climate doesn't understand national, regional or city borders. We have to ensure that there are British voices in congresses across Europe and internationally. And we do have to maintain our links with the SDLP in Northern Ireland, the Irish Greens, the EPP and the SND. And for instance, as I said, the SPD at member state level. We need to strengthen movements for Europe. We have to keep Europe alive in all of our sister societies. We need to continue to commission joint research. We need a regular presence at the newly established UK Friendship Group in the European Parliament. We need debates about Europe at regional and national party conferences. We need to stay active in European Works Councils, Industrial Europe and the ETUC. People will be aware that recently a multinational tried to say that British trade unionists could no longer be part of European Works Councils. Working with our colleagues in the trade union intergroup in the Parliament, we saw that off, but we have to remain vigilant. We are not remaining, but we can still reform. We have to continue to expose the dreadful ramifications of an uncaring Brexit. And indeed, my own party has to be more vocal in this. Somehow, we have to try to bring a right-wing UK press and media on side. We have to keep our cities active in the Covenant of Mayors, Eurocities, the Committee of the Regions. We have to be positive on the Irish Protocol, supporting cross-party Irish MPs and MEPs, and stop talking about triggering Article 16 and claiming to be the best in the world. We need to take a full role in the EU-UK Parliamentary Partnership Assembly and have an active Brussels embassy. This week, Rome Like at Home, legislation that both Claire and I worked on, was extended for 10 years in 27 member states, which means that you are billed the same as you would be at home when you are in a different member state. Obviously, the UK has come out of that legislation. People will have seen that Steve Rotherham, the elected mayor of Merseyside City Region, and Andy Burnham, the elected mayor of Greater Manchester City Region, were both in Ireland today, meeting with, in my view, the wonderful Michael D. Higgins. We've established an Irish embassy now in Manchester, and we are determined to keep those links going between the cities in the Northwest that voted to remain and our colleagues across Europe. And we are working in the same instance with colleagues in the Welsh Assembly. We're no longer part of the EU, but we are Europeans and part of the most successful peace project in history. For the clean air we want for our children, for workers' rights, that's got to be worth fighting for. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Some very different perspectives there to bring into the mix. And I think you've raised some really interesting points, which hopefully, again, we can pick up on the discussion as well. Okay, so I'm going to move forward now. Claire, I'll invite you to join the discussion next. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. I think I am going to inevitably build on the points that have already been made, being fourth in a panel of knowledgeable speakers, and therefore things that I was going to say have been said, so I'm going to repeat them for you all. The first thing I would pick up on actually is Richard's point, which we have to come to terms with what we are now. We are now outsiders. We are no longer at the table. We have got to try and influence from beyond the borders of the European Union. And I would argue we need to do that from a position of, well, right now, as has been said already, from being inside a country where the government is determined to keep itself at arm's length is the kindest way of putting it, keeping a great distance between us and the EU. As Richard said, there's a sort of neuralgia about even mentioning the letters EU in any government position whatsoever. So there is a responsibility, frankly, Teresa picked up on this in terms of keeping those relationships going, but doing it against a very, very difficult backdrop. I want to pick up on a couple of precise ways, or more detailed ways that we can build on that, and reference my region, the Southwest, which again, Richard's point is a very good one and well made about the boundaries being of English regions being fluid at best. You have different boundaries within the Southwest. We have Cornwall that obviously got the most European funding, and I regret to say last year closed its Brussels office, and when it got a Tory majority council. But we have Bristol and Bath and that kind of city region type, two-city region organisation, which still has a very active Brussels office as well, and engagement at that. And what we have at subnational levels is expertise. And we have expertise that's linked into both EU level organisations through connections, but the connections tend to be, can be through non-EU bodies. So, a kind of big example you could take from the Southwest is the Met Office, which has enormous expertise in climate change. It's got some of the largest climate change computing capability in the world, I think, never mind Europe. So it's, it is an extremely impressive organisation. And it is part of a body called EU MetSet, which has an influencing role because it is a European-wide organisation, but it actually has 30 countries, including the UK, and therefore it's on the Brussels scene, but it also involves the UK, and it means that our climate scientists in Exeter, in the Met Office, can engage and be involved in, and their expertise be useful in the EU level work. So it's, there is still that positive role to play, and we do have, dare I mention it, experts in the UK who still can have a voice in those broader organisations. And I think that is something we should keep, be aware of, that's still going on. It's not the same as being a member state. It's not the same as being in the EU and in the negotiating bodies that Teresa was talking about. There are also connections that happen at a kind of sector by sector level. So again, I can make a Southwest reference here, which is that the Southwest region, and in the broadest sense, is the largest aerospace manufacturing region outside of the US in the world. Now, clearly that involves some major players. It involves really big European companies like Airbus, who are serious manufacturers. That's fine. Their relationships go on. They are a European country. They are a player in their own right, a very significant player in a Franco-German company in the EU. So they don't need our help. They don't need any support in those relationships. But their supply chain does. And I think that's where you've got again, a role in those relationships that need to be continued, because, and there are regional, I take aerospace as an example because it's one I'm familiar with. There are regional aerospace organizations, aerospace manufacturing organizations that again cooperate together and then can, sort of build on those existing relationships in the sector. But I don't think that's happening at an organized level sufficiently well. And I think that is something that we are missing a trick on, because we are a newly ex-member who has got very comfortable with being a very influential country inside the EU and has not yet come to terms with the status of being outside the EU. And I think there's, and smaller, small SMEs in sectors like aerospace haven't got the capacity to develop that new sort of diplomacy, if you like, and those new relationships. And there is no help from government to support them building and developing those relationships across supply chains, and therefore, dealing with the new, very, very difficult trading relationship. Takes me to the third bit, which is the relationships and keeping those alive. And that is particularly, Teresa very kindly mentioned my love of and work on research and the European research programme, Horizon 2020, and now Horizon Europe. And we have done, because of what's happening with the Northern Ireland Protocol, although there is an agreement, and it's one area where the British government did say it would continue to have those relationships, that it would continue to take part in the research programme, because of the government's failings in other areas and what, again, referencing Richard, but his reference to David Frost and the way he's behaved. And the fact that Johnson and Frost signed the protocol, it is entirely their negotiating, the way we left and the way the protocol is left is entirely down to what they negotiated in terms of the exit of the UK from the EU. They have put us on the outside, even where we desire to be a part of things like the research programme. But universities and the research network, there's been a lot of work done on both sides of the channel to try and press for both sides of the negotiations to have that relationship, because we, I hope, will eventually take part in Horizon Europe, in that next research programme. And if we do, we need not to be doing it from way back there. We need to have the relationship, so when we start back in, we're doing it without having lost too much ground, and we can do it with partners. And I know, again, the universities are doing a huge amount of work, and I'm sure others on this call could talk about that in greater depth, but it's those relationships. So finally, I would look forward, because the situation we're in at the moment, I think, from a national governance perspective, is unsustainable. And therefore, we will have to start building back into a relationship with our nearest and dearest neighbours. And if, you know, from a trade perspective, from a research perspective, from the climate change perspective that Teresa was talking about, particularly from a foreign and security perspective, then foreign policy and security policy perspective, then we absolutely need to reconstruct a relationship with the EU. Now, if you look at how other countries do that, and a very good example of this is Norway, then they have a 5-year, I think it's 5-year strategy around their relationship with the EU. Now, clearly they have a much closer relationship, it operates, but within that strategy, they explicitly involve the national actors that can have a voice in Brussels, even though they're not in the EU itself formally. And they organize, they have a very large permanent representation in Brussels. And this goes to Stephen's point as well, that they have staffed up, absolutely staffed up, but they support and network the national organizations to be in Brussels as well, because they get that different, they get into different fora than the member state, than the national state would get into, but coordinate and use the same arguments and push out. So that is something that we need to be planning for and need to be doing. And you would ideally have a UK government working with the Scottish office in Brussels, working with the Welsh office in Brussels, Liverpool, the Bristol and Bath office, and doing all that coordination, as well as with, national, with the universities, with national organizations. So again, I think from the position of wanting the UK to do well and wanting the UK to stay whole, sorry, Stephen, I think we need absolutely to be coordinating that work and building those connections. And finally, that's not just with the offices in Brussels, but it's also those connections that Teresa was talking about. And there are many of those European actors who have British connections and British relationships. So, Stephen was talking about Angus Robertson, who is half German, well, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and who's been a leading actor in the European Parliament, and leading actor around Brexit is indeed David McAllister, who is half Scottish. And so, he has those connections. So I would say we need to recognize where those relationships are, and we need to coordinate and build on those relationships, because we are going to have to strengthen what we do and change the TCA and renegotiate the TCA going forward. And sort of engaging in the programs like the research program, we've got to plan for that and not let all those all the connections that we have had just dissipate too much and erode too much, and get ready to start doing better as a country in the connections going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Really interesting insights there. I particularly like the comparison with the Norwegian model. So let's see how that plays out in our discussions as well. Thank you. So final panelist this evening is Kirsty Hughes. Thank you, Kirsty. The floor is yours. Kirsty, you're still on mute, unfortunately.
I thought someone was going to unmute me, but I can do it myself. I was just saying thank you for inviting me, and it's great to be part of this event. I want to make 5 points, if I can fit them into my 5 or 6 minutes. And some of those will obviously relate to what has been said before, but hopefully I can add at this stage still to the discussion. Firstly, it seems to me that if you look at the Scottish government, it does have a reasonably clear, fairly thin, but nonetheless reasonably clear European strategy. And I think that European strategy is very distinct to the UK government's strategy, if it's even fair to say that the UK government has an EU strategy. I think it has an ideology that drives its behaviour towards the EU. That might be a more accurate way to put it. But I think it's worth just listing some of those differences between the UK and Scottish governments, because they're rather stark. The Scottish government has good relations with the EU. It's well regarded within the EU. I did a paper a year and a half ago on how the EU looks at the UK and how it looks at Scotland. It was a very stark contrast. As Stephen Geffen said, the Scottish government is obviously pro-EU, and it was and is opposed to Brexit. I think importantly as well, the Scottish government and people in Scotland recognise the importance and power and potential power of the EU as a body. Whereas, of course, the UK government and Boris Johnson's efforts to underline global Britain, whatever that means, really tries to downplay the EU as an actor. Last but not least, of course, the Scottish government aims at independence in the EU. Having said that, you could say that nonetheless there's some overlap between the Scottish and UK governments. They both claim to want good and strong bilateral relationships with EU member states. They both want to prioritise climate change. And I would say in the context of the war in Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine, I guess at least at headline level, if not in the detail of how allowing Ukrainian refugees into the country is being handled, there's some agreement there as well. But that is a lot of differences. And that brings me to my second point, which is just to say something briefly about independence and where independence fits into all this. I think it's absolutely inevitable that independence is always there in UK-Scottish government relations, even when the matters are purely devolved, and they often or mostly will be, there are always going to be implications in one way or another, however directly or indirectly, for independence. So whether you're talking about the question of the power grabs after Brexit of devolved powers, or you're talking about the degree of consultation about Brexit and the deals that were done, there was almost none. As Richard touched on, whether you're talking about migration powers, environment, the Internal Market Act, even Scotland's EU hubs, all of those are very strongly intertwined from both the Scottish and the UK government side in different ways with independence. And I think it's also, if one's thinking about Scotland-EU relations, it's very important to understand the EU perspective on Scotland at the moment. I think when I've talked to different players in different EU member states and in Brussels, it's not that they've all suddenly decided that Scottish independence is a great thing, but there is, since the 2016 vote, there is a lot more sympathy for Scotland. There's gratitude that Scotland proved to be the most European part of the UK. And there is more understanding of why a big chunk of the Scottish population support independence. And I think what's important about that, depending where the politics goes in the next decade, let's say, is whereas in 2014 with the independence vote, the EU was neutral, but I would say negatively so, was trying to support the UK government, I would say there's either a genuine or in a way a slightly positive neutrality there perhaps at the moment. And I think one difference when you look at this from Scotland, and I imagine Stephen will agree, having heard the presentations about Wales and England, and there's much to agree with in them, but yes, of course we're outside the EU now. Of course that's understood with all its negative impacts in Scotland. But the prospect of being back in the EU is not some very distant prospect here, depending on your views of when there'll be an independence referendum and whether that independence referendum is likely to be won, and then how fast or slow the path to the EU might be. But frankly, I would think it's more likely that Scotland will be an independent country in the EU in 10 years' time than that it won't be. And I don't think there's almost any chance that the UK will be back in the EU within the next 10 years, for instance. So I think the way the debate is thought about and the way it happens in the different parts of the UK, in Northern Ireland obviously different again, is very important to to stay alert to when we're having such helpful panels as you've put on today. Let me say something briefly about paradiplomacy. I said the Scottish Government has a European strategy. It prioritises in that the environment, it prioritises well-being, it prioritises the digital and innovative economy. I would say the Scottish Government certainly has a paradiplomatic strategy or practices paradiplomacy, but I would also say the Scottish Government is remarkably wary of using that term, of acknowledging that it's doing that, or of saying how it is going about that in a comprehensive way. So yes, you've got Scottish Government offices in Brussels, you've got hubs in Dublin, in Berlin, in Paris, which I think is fascinating. You're going to have one soon in Copenhagen. You've got all sorts of relationships across the EU that SNP politicians and others are promoting. But as for actually putting into the public domain an admission that this is some sort of coherent approach, that's rather missing. And I think it's a reluctance to take the flak from opposition parties for that. Stephen may disagree with me on that, is part, and to be accused of exceeding Scotland's devolved powers. But actually, as this panel in a sense is discussing, to interact with Europe and with European countries and with the EU is perfectly normal, both for regions within EU member states and for substates of third countries. So I think there is that paradiplomacy, but I think one of the reasons it's going to be so controversial is always going to come back to the independence question. You know, from the sort of Unionist Party point of view in Scotland at the moment, those sort of very small hubs in those national capitals are potentially proto-embassies. From the SNP and the Scottish Government point of view, well, they're not proto-embassies, but they're certainly not going to do any harm in presenting Scotland as a mature, normal, functioning democracy and showing how it could be a future EU member state. So both sides can at one level have a point, but the outcome of that is you get a lot of controversy. That means, I think, and this is my fourth point, there is a very unstable triangle going on here. You've got Scotland-EU relations, you've got UK-EU relations, and you've got Scotland-UK relations. And whereas the Scotland-EU relations are currently, in a way, fairly stable as they can be given all the impact of Brexit, the other two parts of the triangle are obviously very unstable, how London is relating to Brussels and to Edinburgh, and I agree with everything that Richard Wynne-Jones said about that. So I think that's a very tricky triangle, and I think much as Scotland is well regarded in Brussels, it has lost a lot of influence for two reasons. One reason is Brexit, for all the reasons my fellow panelists have pointed out. But the other is the lack of Scottish Government influence within the UK and on the UK government. And that's not just Scotland, that's Wales as well, as Richard said. But you know, I've had people in Brussels say to me, well, it's great that Nicola Sturgeon turned up and talked to Michel Barnier when the Brexit talks were going on, and it's great that the Scottish Government support a soft Brexit, but unless they have some say in the position Theresa May and then Boris Johnson took on that, well, you know, it's not actually a terribly relevant or important meeting. Obviously, you can, and the Scottish Government will, and I think it's very important, do a lot of relationship building and lobbying and information gathering as a sub-state of a third country. That's difficult. We're outside the room. It will be harder work for less result than when we were in the EU. But despite that, it's definitely worth doing, and look at all the other countries and regions, Quebec, North Norway, and so on, that do that. Last but not least, let me just say a couple of things about the Brexit process. I think I can keep that short because, as I said, I agree with pretty much most of what Richard said about that. I mean, what we saw throughout the Brexit process was an almost complete lack of any serious or genuine consultation with the devolved governments by the UK government. And I think it's worth just reminding ourselves, Theresa May set up the Joint Ministerial Committee EU negotiations at the start of that process. And the outline document for that said the committee would aim to ensure as far as possible that outcomes agreed by all four governments are secured from these negotiations, these Brexit negotiations. Well, obviously that's not true. It's not only that the outcome was not one that was agreed by the four governments, but there was no effort to make that true. And it's very hard to see how these new intergovernmental relation structures are going to actually function. They declare wonderful warm goals of consensus in decision-making, mutual respect, and so forth. And I just don't see that happening. I had better conclude because I'm out of time. I wanted to just say something very briefly about, I mean, we're, in another 1 or 2 years, we're in general election time. It's possible we will have a Labour government in the UK. I would expect that would create better relations with the EU, more stable relations with the EU. I would expect that to ameliorate some of the barriers that the Trade and Cooperation Agreement have put in place. But I'm not sure how much that is going to change these devolved to UK government relations we're talking about and where the future UK-EU path goes. Firstly, because Starmer is very, very clearly and carefully not saying that under him the UK would rejoin the single market or the customs union. He's also not saying that there will be an independence referendum. He's talking about constitutional change, but even if Gordon Brown comes along with a proposal for home rule, and that's Keir Starmer's pitch to the UK and Welsh and Scottish electorates, if there isn't an EU dimension to that, and if there isn't a recognition, as Stephen Gethin said right at the start, that 65% of under 55-year-olds in Scotland support independence, I think we'd still be here in 3 or 4 years' time talking about the same problems, albeit with a slightly better UK-EU relationship. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsty, and thank you to all of the panellists. Some really excellent contributions to the discussion here. And there is a bit of a chat emerging. If anybody has any further questions, please could I ask you just to put them in the Q&A box as well. So I'd like to just draw together some of the themes, if that's possible. One of the questions that's come up in the chat is to do with a more agile approach to an international relations strategy or foreign policy strategy with the European Union. And I think that chimes with the notion that the quality of intergovernmental relations in the UK is questionable. In some of the interviews that I've conducted in some academic research, it descended into farce, were the words that I took away from some of those conversations. In the absence of a robust framework for consensus building on foreign policy, is it more likely that we'll see independent strategies at the sub-state level for engaging with the European Union? Is it as a result of the lack of a formal mechanism or a strong and robust formal mechanism within the UK that we will see greater and enhanced engagement with the EU? In your presentation, Claire, you were quite clear about the way that opportunities were being lost because there wasn't an organisational capacity and that sort of supply chain in and around the aerospace industry. Where is the capacity likely to be found? How can we harness those kind of opportunities which are potentially being lost? What needs to happen next in that relationship building going forward? If anybody would like to offer some points or reflections on this sort of notion of agility or more flexibility.
Yes, different parts of, so you mentioned me, so I thought I'd just leap in and then really interested in what others have got to say. I think there's different parts of the country, and absent a national strategy, there's a real problem in that people in the regions are scrabbling around to do it for themselves. And without that kind of blueprint and indeed that coordination, then there are mixed effects. And clearly, with the state of the economy and continuing challenges, deep challenges for local authority and kind of combined authority budgets, then you've got a real issue of pressure on that investment. And where there is difficulty in demonstrating what that investment is going to deliver in the short term. Because I think with the nations, Wales and Scotland can, kind of show that they've got this kind of coordinated national position that reaches out. In Scotland government sense, it's about, potential future independence as well. But if you don't have that ongoing investment, then when we do get a change of government, when we do get, and I think, I will build on Kirsty's remarks that clearly I would hope there's a Labour government after the next election, and I would want that to continue to change the relationship that it is currently. You will then be able to effectively use those ongoing relationships. And it goes back to the point that I was making, is that if you've lost those relationships, then you aren't going to be able to, it's harder to rebuild them than if you've carried them on, if you like, and had those relationships. Sorry, that was not the perfect answer, and I will let Richard and Stephen come back in. I may try a second bite at that one.
So, Richard, your hand is up.
I think it was Stephen first.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I wasn't watching.
Okay, the point I want to make is it picks up on something that was said by one of my colleagues on the panel. And what I want to emphasize is it's not normal for regions in third countries to have relationships with the European level. Right? It depends on the attitude of the third country itself. So Norway is a good example of this. The Norwegian state is deeply relaxed. I spend a lot of time in Norway. Regions are very controversial in Norway. A lot of the politics of Norway is dominated by hostility to Frogn, which is the super region around Oslo, if you're interested, right? But the Norwegian government is relaxed about regions having relationships with the European level. The UK government is not relaxed about this. The UK government is deeply hostile to the idea. It's very uncomfortable with alternative centres of power within the UK having different views and different voices, and certainly about those being projected beyond the state. And so, if the national strategy, as far as the UK government is concerned, is its strategy. It's not about building consensus, or it's not about being relaxed about the fact that Wales may have a different view, or Scotland may have a different view, or the Manchester City region. That's not where we're at with the UK. So I think we just have to be. I'm sorry, I don't want to be pouring cold water over our collective heads, and what I would wish is something very different, but that's where we are. Regions do not have an automatic right of access. The European level, because it is a club of sovereign states, ultimately, is very respectful of the boundaries that the third countries put on the interaction of the third countries' regions with the European level. That doesn't mean that you can't do things, right? And that is complicated. One of the things that we've seen, certainly the work that I've done on paradiplomacy, relationships between Wales and Scotland beyond the EU level before Brexit, was very much about how the Foreign and Commonwealth Office policed the relationships of Wales and Scotland very, very carefully. That was before Brexit. It was actually quite relaxed about this stuff compared to where it is now. So I think we have to be there are things that we can do, they're worth doing, but they are going to be very heavily constrained. And also, and I think this is an important point to make, there are, given public spending constraints, given how little money there is floating around, there are some hard choices involved in, having a big Welsh presence in Brussels is something I'd be very keen on. But Norway's there because Norway's in the single market. There's a mechanism. There's a social consensus in Norway that this is sensible. In the UK, we don't have that consensus. We have the exact opposite, and there are hard choices involved in the Welsh or Scottish government investing heavily in maintaining those links when the UK government is in a position to render a lot of those efforts null and void. Sorry.
No, we totally see where you're coming from. Thank you. You're absolutely right to pour a bit of cold water on it. It's good to have a reality check, though. Stephen, your hand, I think, was next.
Yeah, I'm really glad that Richard went first, because I agree with him. And I'm going to make a couple of quick points on this. It's not just the Conservative Party who've been very uncomfortable with paradiplomacy. Consecutive Labour governments have been very uncomfortable, and in my own book, Nation to Nation, which you referenced earlier on, both surviving former Labour First Ministers I interviewed reflected on this. I've got an interview with Susan Stewart, the first Secretary in the Scottish office in Washington, very uncomfortable with the idea that Scotland had its own paradiplomacy. Same goes for the Welsh government as well. And I want another bit of context here, which is I'd encourage anybody who's interested to read the Lord Cooper judgment. The ideas of sovereignty are different in Scotland and England. I'm sorry, I can't comment on Wales, but this idea of full parliamentary sovereignty does not exist north of the border, which has made this whole thing very difficult. And I want to bring on my final point. It's maybe one of gentle disagreement with my friends and colleagues here. We talk about consensus building. Well, actually, maybe the constituent parts of the United Kingdom, for as long as there are constituent parts, have different foreign policy goals. They have different goals in terms of the European Union. That's okay. If we think about GM crops, if we think about renewable energy, the Scottish government has had a different policy position from the UK government, and has got and should be able to pursue that in a European context. That's something that's quite important. And I'll leave you with this final thought. This is not something that's unusual. If you look across the Nordic states, or even the German land, or even in Belgium, different constituent parts of that state entity will have different foreign policy goals. And often, and I hear this from Labour colleagues in particular, they talk about more devolution in order to make all of this okay. Actually, the reform needs to be at a UK whole level. If you believe in the UK, it has to be at a UK level. Whereas for me, actually, if you look at the Nordic states, they can have a Nordic identity, they can have different relationships with the EU, be it Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland, and the sub-state entities, the Åland Islands, Greenland, Faroes, all have different relationships with the EU and their state as well. So there are solutions to this, but they're ones which I'm afraid voters in England, and I'll pass over to Richard on this one, are not comfortable, but that takes bravery from Labour and Conservative politicians, I'm afraid. Sorry. There endeth, but we have opened up a really big issue here.
Bravery, thank you. Teresa, I think you were next in line, thanks.
Richard, I agree with everything that you said, and Stephen, I don't disagree with you on everything that you said. You mentioned the word farce, Carolyn. Between the referendum and Brexit, not only did the UK government not send ministers to ministerial meetings, they didn't send technical staff to the technical meetings. And as we all know, actually the work gets done at the technical level in order to facilitate a political agreement. So right from the referendum, we went around the table. In terms of combined authorities, and I put it in the chat, and again, I'm agreeing with Richard here, even Liverpool City Region and Greater Manchester Combined Authority have got different powers. I mean, they're neighbouring combined authorities. In Liverpool doesn't include the Police and Crime Commissioner. In Manchester, far much more about health, and it includes the Police and Crime Commissioner function in terms of BEV. The regional identity of the Northwest was very much a European regional identity, and that's gone. So part of the problem that we have is we don't have, sorry to sound negative, a consistency of approach to the bodies that could then, within the regions at a sub-regional level, A, talk to each other, but B, then talk to colleagues in the European Union. So the agility point is a really important one. And I can't remember whether it was Richard or Stephen, what we also don't have is resource. So I outlined some of the relationships that myself and my colleagues are trying to keep going. And I know in the chat, I can see other colleagues out there trying to keep relationships going, but we're doing it from our kitchen tables. You know, there is no resource. Thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. And Kirsty, you wanted to join in there?
Yes, just I disagree with Richard, but I also wonder if we're just to some extent describing the same thing differently. I don't think anybody on this panel is suggesting that there are 4 different foreign policies across the 4 constituent parts of the UK nation. The word paradiplomacy does not imply that. I think, you know, and also some of this is just much more practical and pragmatic. So the Scottish Government hubs are located in or by UK embassies. You know, when the Scottish Government Berlin hub does its work, it's doing some really interesting work, as I understand it, on looking at business opportunities around hydrogen, so Scottish-German activities on hydrogen. Interestingly, last April, May, it did look like the UK government was about to make more of a fuss about Scotland's EU hubs. David Frost wrote a acerbic letter about them, and some other MP or MSP, Stephen will remember, Tory, jumped up and down about them as well. But actually then it went quiet and they backed off, and they obviously decided that wasn't the fight for the moment. And there was actually also a behind the scenes fight about trying to get the hub's personnel to report directly to the ambassadors and not to the Scottish governments. But the UK government also backed off that one. So of course it's not easy being a sub-state in a third country of a very centralized nation, but there are things you can do. And I think the politics of this, of course, the EU is extremely cautious and alert to Scotland's constitutional issues. But it's very interesting to go back and remember after Brexit Day, and Nicola Sturgeon went to Brussels within about a week and met Jean-Claude Juncker, who I don't think would normally, or if it had been a pro-EU vote, have done that. You've got 38 MEPs in the informal European Parliament Scottish Friendship Group, a group, interestingly enough, that is serviced by the Scottish Government office in Brussels. You know, so I mean, this would take another whole panel to get into some of the detail of this, to look at what Quebec, for instance, does in Brussels. But you know, these things have both political roles in terms of what the Scottish Government is doing and its long-term aim of independence in the EU, and then they have functional, important, small and micro business roles. And I think one last comment here, Scottish Government has been very clear to make it clear to its EU counterparts that it is not expecting them to do anything other than be neutral on the independence issue, and that it understands that we are now outside the EU, that if we voted for independence, we would have to go through a normal accession process. So there is a very deliberate political stance there of not trying to suggest we're exceptional, that we need any favours, that we need any support. So you've got this multi-level politics going on, from independence through to just micro types of business support post-Brexit.
Great, thank you, Kirsty. Interesting just to pick up on some of the themes that are circulating here and in the chat as well. You mentioned that the Scottish government has a strategy of positioning individuals within UK embassies globally as well. And I understand that speaks to this conversation about paradiplomacy. I had an interview with an official who worked at the British Embassy for the UK government, and his job was to go to those meetings with the Scottish representative who might have been visiting and to make sure they were saying the right things. So there was a degree of control over that, and that has been in evidence in other situations as well, such as in Brussels, where the First Minister arrived and wasn't allowed a UK car because the UK government didn't know what she was going to be saying and who she was going to be meeting in Brussels. So there's a real tension, and I think that again speaks to Stephen's point about different political parties. The whole kind of culture of the UK government has been very sensitive to any notion of paradiplomacy or multi-layered interaction. So I'm going to pick up a question here that's been posted in our chat as well. And it's whether or not the UK government is actually genuinely committed to anything like an inclusive form of diplomacy or international engagement, trade. You know, are we moving away from a vision that relies heavily on the Westminster Whitehall vision? Are there any kind of incentives at the UK level to decentralise some of the kind of less politicised functions? You were talking about a distinction, Kirsty, between a political engagement internationally and a functional engagement. I think that's a very real and clear differentiation that we need to understand. Is there any incentive or any thinking at the UK level, at the central state level, as to, you know, the opportunities that are potentially there for releasing some of the functional interactions internationally and harnessing that? The chat is saying the current UK government has no appetite for this. It's looking to claw back devolution, if anything, and herein lies the problem as it relates to EU relations and beyond for all UK nations and regions. You know, that contrasts quite sharply with the international traction of non-state actors. Can
I just jump in there, Carol?
Yeah, sure.
Because I was just going to agree very strongly with whoever made the comment in the chat. So the question, I've lost control of where these comments are ending up. But you know, the UK government is simply not interested in an inclusive approach. I mean, they'd probably condemn that as hopelessly woke and all kinds of. And actually, I mean, I take the distinction. I think it is a useful distinction that Kirsty advances, the difference between kind of functional and more, if you like, more obviously politicized things. But the UK government is currently treating everything as highly politicized. And so this is again one of the problems, because as I try to, no doubt incoherently in my presentation, explain, you know, what we have is the UK government cleaving to a particular understanding of state sovereignty, in which any alternative power centre is inherently a threat because of its very existence. And so, you know, look at the way that the UK government is very deliberately cutting out the devolved governments in Scotland and Wales from kind of the economic powers that have been repatriated from the UK. They are very deliberately bypassing the devolved governments and all of that, because, and this is functionally hugely dysfunctional. This is, you know, because the expertise lies at the devolved government, but they'd rather mess it up than engage with devolved government. So I'm afraid that, you know, that's where we are.
Thank you, Richard. Does anybody else want to add in? Claire, I think you're next.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we're all mostly in danger of agreeing with each other too much. So just perhaps I will question, I think the UK government, and particularly this UK government, most particularly this UK government, has no conception in its head of what devolution could or should do. I think it just doesn't seem to compute with this government. You look at the way they've operated with the various different funds and other things that have been supposed to be around levelling up and various points, and as Theresa mentioned, the utter mess of devolution options in England and how those are operated and the randomness of those. So I think there's a mindset that doesn't work for this, from this UK government in particular. I think you then also get into the realm of cock up or conspiracy. And on the whole, history is mostly on the side of cock up. I think that when you look at the inability of this government to pull a consistent and, even year-long strategy together. They haven't been able to bring out the energy strategy that was supposed to be brought out today. God knows what levelling up is actually going to mean when they've cut and pasted from Wikipedia the pages in the white paper for this. To put it very kindly, there's a randomness to how policy works out at this national government level. So, I think what we are talking about, and the points that Kirsty was making in terms of the kind of functional diplomacy that could be done, paradiplomacy that could be done, I think at the moment we have to look at that from the point of view of it's done to substitute action at a national level, not to complement it or to or run parallel to it. And therefore, that is, I think, largely the thrust of what I've been trying to say, is that we've got to do things despite the government now, and doing that, making the most of the expertise that lies in devolved administrations and the nations as well as the regions as well as the nations, and also in the expertise that lies in the regions. And that's the point about continuing the relationship, regardless of where we're at currently with the UK-EU relations.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. That's great. I agree with everything you're saying there. Kirsty, you're next in line. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I suspect, Stephen, you were before me, but anyway, I should try and be brief. Yeah, I think on the recentralisation, certainly I agree with Richard. I think it's deliberate, it's ideological. So for all the sort of randomness that Claire points to, I think there's a very clear ideological drive here, and it's one that has extraordinary characteristics. When you look at the new UK government building that they deliberately cited next to Waverley train station in Edinburgh, with UK governments down the side and part of the Union Jack visible, it's the most crudest of centralising symbolism. But I think that the challenge of one's looking forward, because even we don't know where British politics is going. It was the Tory government in the 90s that first set up Scotland Europa in Brussels. Keir Starmer talks about constitutional change. Is that going to be home rule? What would that mean? How do you do asymmetric federalism in a polity like the UK? Are you going to devolve trade and migration like we do see in some substates around the world? Is England really ready for what that would mean, or is it going to be much more partial? And even if you did that, that's not going to take away, as I said in my introductory remarks, question of independence in the EU. In fact, the irony is the more that you did have in a future scenario a Labour government taking the UK closer to the EU, the easier that would make Scotland, rest of UK relations, if Scotland was independent in the EU and the UK was outside. Thank you.
And that's a good point you raised there, Kirsty. I think we haven't really touched on that, but it's this notion of asymmetry. We have obviously different strategies as has been presented, and different powers across the entirety of the UK's territory. But that asymmetry doesn't have to be a negative, and it speaks to this notion that an agility in foreign policy or a European policy, a more flexible interpretation of what is an effective UK strategy for engaging with the EU, needs to recognise that and embrace that asymmetry. So, Stephen, you're the last one in line on this question.
Thanks. Actually, that point on asymmetry takes me back to my very first comments, which was one of the challenges that you've got in the UK is that you have devolution. The rest of the UK, and I deliberately said Conservative governments and successive Labour governments never quite got to grips with devolution. One of the problems for that was when Scottish Parliament, Welsh Parliament were set up. you didn't get that kind of agreement at a UK level. There is no structure for disagreement. There is no structure for who's responsible for what. Scotland has had for hundreds of years its own distinctive foreign policy. The Scottish Government, like previous administrations, has its own distinctive foreign policy. That becomes even more acute when you have what many people have described. Lots of people will disagree with what I'm about to say, and that's fine. But what people perceive to be an English nationalist government at Westminster at the moment. That is the nature of this government, and it's also very centralising. Now, when your flagship project at a UK level is Brexit, leaving the EU, don't expect the Scottish Government anytime soon to stop pointing out increases in the cost of your food, increases in the cost of energy, trade being hit, as Rishi Sunak was talking about today, being highlighted by the Scottish Government as it makes a case for independence, but as it makes a case for why it's distinct and different from the UK parties. That is the nature of politics, to make these cases. So none of this will go away, and it comes back to the point that we made at the very start, which is that internal, if you want the UK to survive, I'm somebody that doesn't, but if you do, then reforming those structures fundamentally in the UK, from the House of Lords to the way it operates, to even the ideas of parliamentary sovereignty, is something that's going to have to happen. I don't see it happening, incidentally, in which case the EU has driven that wedge between Scotland and certainly the rest of the UK that could still mean the end of the UK, which is my final comment I'll say, could actually be very good for everybody in the UK as they seek that reset.
Thank you, Stephen, of course. And I don't necessarily want to conclude on a negative note, so I'm just going to throw one final question out there that offers a degree of optimism into the conversation. So is perhaps the solution elsewhere? Someone in the chat has been asking if we have scope, or is there potential scope for more region-to-region interactions outside of the EU institutions or the EU fora themselves? So in areas where regions and local authorities do have some competence, is that where we see partnership working, leading to something more effective and something more substantive? Is there the scope for localities to partner with regions outside of the UK in order to tackle those very shared challenges in the areas for which they're responsible? So leaving aside some kind of EU nexus, but looking to establish the kind of multiple bilateralism at a regional level. Potentially. Kirsty, thank you. You've put your hands up.
Yes, just briefly. So I was just agreeing to unmute. But I think some of that is already happening. You know, so I mean, I'm not quite sure how many people there are in the Scottish Government's hub in Berlin at the moment, but when I was there a year or so or two ago, it was 3 or 4, I think. They were talking to people in Berlin, governmental, non-governmental. They were going out as much as they could out to the regions. So, I mean, I think there is some of that going on. And obviously it's not just from devolved governments and English regions. It's not just from government level. And I think that's terribly important in the hope that we will all have a more European future, that you've got an enormous amount of business, of civil society, of cultural, all sorts of links like that. You know, the ideology here again of the present UK government is clear. So it decided not to completely wreck UK scientific research by signing up to Horizon. The problems with that were discussed earlier. But ideologically, Erasmus could not be allowed to go ahead, even though Scottish and Welsh governments clearly wanted it, and that would have been a way to engage youth. And there are many other examples. So, I mean, I don't see, in the context of Brexit and the context of the current government, because they reinforce each other in negative ways, that you can do much more than the type of things that are being done at the moment. So it's not that nothing's happening, and it's not that it's irrelevant for those things to happen, but it's not going to become something bigger and better, I don't think, sadly.
It's more ad hoc as opposed to some kind of strategic vision to embrace all of this or to maximise this.
Well, I think it doesn't have to be ad hoc, but there are always resource constraints, you know. But yeah, I mean, certainly on the business side, on the NGO side, you know, NGOs in Scotland are certainly trying to remain part of, as they can, and businesses too, of European networks. But most of the time, even if they are able to stay in those networks, they have less influence and less voice.
Yeah, thank you. So Teresa, and then Claire, and then we'll wrap up there, if that's okay.
Very briefly, just for information, Liverpool situation and Manchester situation also wanted to remain in Erasmus, and it's a tragedy for our young people that that's not happening. But I see in the chat that there is the Welsh Government has its own Erasmus replacement scheme. Well done, Welsh Government. It's just to say, to pick up on something that Claire said earlier, some of this is actually happening on a sectoral level. So climate change NGOs are talking to climate change NGOs right across Europe and indeed the world. But certainly in my region, and I work closely with my local authorities, we haven't got the capacity or the strategy yet for it to happen from a governmental sub-regional level. And I wondered, kind of a question back to you, Carolyn, is anybody mapping actually what it is that's going on?
In a word, probably no. I'll invite Claire to share her comments.
I was adding, because you were desperately seeking for us to make positive contributions towards the end. So the thing I would say is that we perhaps don't recognise often enough, but ought to more, the soft power that this country gets from our British citizens, our British nationals, if you like, who are operating in this, you know, our academics, our NGO expertise, our, you know, some corporate connections, and those regional connections. That is what keeps the UK's reputation alive, because let's face it, this government is not doing its best to do that. But you know, the people still have a huge respect and still want to engage with British people, and it's you know, I think that's worth celebrating.
Claire, that is a lovely last comment, and I'm tempted to just wrap things up there and let us all reflect on that. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank all of the participants this evening. To Stephen, thank you for joining us on your birthday. Richard, thank you. Teresa, Claire, and Kirsty as well. Fantastic contributions. Really interesting to hear all of those different perspectives, and you know, find out where the common threads are and the potential is as well, and where different voices can move forward. So thank you also to the Foreign Policy Centre for hosting us this evening, and to Poppy for organising everything. And thank you to everyone in the chat who's been joining in the discussion, and for all the questions that have been put forward. I would like to wish you all a very enjoyable evening. Thank you so much again for coming along, and I hope to see you again at a future event with the Foreign Policy Centre. So thank you, and good evening.